I think it's important to stay humble, remember that we are guests on someone else's land, and act like it. Act like good guests. I think that's a sort of definition of the human mission at this point in history. But you have to explore these things a little more deeply, and so I learned something about the Bowl with One Spoon Wampum Treaty tonight that I didn't know, because you took that occasion to do a little popular education. So I really want to celebrate that. I find the territorial acknowledgement particularly poignant today, of all days, when we have yesterday's brutal and shameful approval of 2 new tar sands pipelines by our federal government. And when on this very day at the Supreme Court of Canada in Ottawa, 2 First Nations were appearing before the Supreme Court, the culmination of years of legal struggle resisting 2 other fossil fuel projects. So massive support to the Chippewas of the Thames as they fight Enbridge's Line 9 pipeline reversal, and to the Inuit community of Clyde River as they try to prevent seismic blasting to explore for Arctic oil and gas. They were at the Supreme Court today. As far as I understand, the hearings went well. We can only hope that the Supreme Court gives us a precedent from these 2 important decisions today that will help us fight these pipelines that just got approved. As the LEAP Manifesto, I think, makes abundantly clear, when Indigenous communities fight for their rights, they're fighting for us all. And as and the lesson of idle no more, for those of us in settler society, still rings incredibly true on today of all days, that our last best hope for finding a more balanced and sane way of life on Turtle Island is following Indigenous leadership and supporting their struggle for land rights. And so I think it's worth a moment to just contemplate these things at the beginning. So I was going to talk about Trump, and we will, and then this bloody thing happened yesterday. I'm like, okay, forget that. That's last week's news. And the next 4 to 8 years. We'll get to that. But I feel like we have to try to, as a community, before I even talk about the LEAP Manifesto, absorb, fully grok what the hell happened in Canada yesterday. Because I think it's monumentally significant, and I think, to borrow a recent phrase, it changes everything. With those pipeline announcements yesterday, we have very close to 1 million barrels a day of potential new tar sands production, growth of tar sands production in Canada. And with those announcements and a number of others, just in the last weeks, no more than a month and a bit, we finally have a very clear picture of the Trudeau government's climate plan. And I would like to take a few minutes right now and really break it down for you. And in order to do that, we're not unveiling a portrait this evening. It's in my rider. If there's ever a portrait of me anywhere, I flee. Someone else's portrait might be nice. But actually, this is my cutting-edge digital presentation tool, which our next generation digital team worked for hours on today. I'm shifting to hand mic, and I'm going to move it out where some of you can see it. All right, how's that? You guys, I know, I'm sorry. Can you guys see it if we can take it over for them? People, this is Canada, we're going to have to compromise. All right, so first of all, I want to say that I'm indebted to the researcher Barry Saxifrage, who published a version of this in the National Observer 1 week ago. I have shamelessly bastardized his research and presentation in order to do this with you tonight. Okay. This is where we are now at in Canada in terms of our climate strategy. The Trudeau government went to Paris, and they brought the shitty, insufficient old Harper targets. Remember that? Yeah. They were not going to improve upon them, and then they've clarified that they will not improve upon them. So those shitty old, insufficient Harper targets commit us to reducing our carbon dioxide emissions by 200 megatons a year by 2030. Don't get lost in the numbers here, we're looking at the proportions. So that's 14 freaking years from now, right? That's 14 years from now. And that's where we need to get. This is where we're at now. We need to get our emissions down to the bottom in 14 years. So they've also announced a couple of their flagship climate policies. The main one is the carbon tax. Well, actually, the most recent one is the coal phase-out. So they announced that they will be working with the provinces to have a national phase-out of coal-fired power generation by 2030. And that's about how much of a carbon emissions reduction it represents, 5 megatons a year. So it gets us roughly 3% of the way to the goal. Then we've got the carbon tax, which has been, if you follow the mainstream media, it's pretty much all we're talking about in terms of climate policy. The carbon tax, will there be a price? Whose price will it be? Will Ontario and Quebec's completely unproven and likely to be disastrous cap and trade plan, amount to how much of the carbon tax? Forget all that. Let's say the whole country gets to $50 a ton of carbon. That's a carbon tax across the whole country by 2030, as the government has announced. It will represent that kind of emissions reduction, 18 megatons a year. And so what else have we had in the same period? Well, we had the Pacific Northwest LNG project in the liquefied natural gas project in British Columbia, which will represent, see this red amount right here? That's the 12 megatons of carbon that is created, carbon dioxide emissions, that is created in the fracking. It's all fracked gas in BC for liquefied natural gas, almost all of it. So that's the carbon dioxide leaking and emissions associated with extracting the resource. Then we've got the Line 3 doubling, the doubling of capacity in the Line 3 pipeline that was announced yesterday. That's the red there, another 12 megatons or so annually. And then we have the tripling of the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Express pipeline, which represents another 19 megatons a year, just in the extraction and transport processing of the resource. That's all they're counting. So you can already see that if you take these amounts, take away the green, we're going up, not down. The problem is that when you extract fossil fuels, you don't extract them to just put them on a pipeline and then when they get to their destination, they disappear. You're extracting them and processing them and transporting them to burn them. But we don't count the emissions for burning them. We want that to be on China's balance sheet, on America's balance sheet, on somebody else's carbon emissions. But the atmosphere doesn't give a damn about where they're burned. That resource is being yanked out of the earth in Alberta or in BC and processed and shipped and sent somewhere to be burned to turn into carbon in the atmosphere. So if you look at the whole carbon impact of the resource, you get a much larger figure. This is what they call the downstream emissions, the emissions associated with burning them somewhere else. Nobody in Canada, in the mainstream media or in the political class, is going to be talking about the massive majority of the emissions associated with these resources. My point here is that even just on the resources that we count here in Canada, this plan has us going in the wrong direction. But in terms of the overall, what happened yesterday and what's happened in the past 6 weeks, in terms of seeing what the Trudeau approach to climate is going to be, I've done you a favor in my high-tech way, and I've done the math. I took these amounts, the full carbon impact associated with these 3 fossil fuel projects, and the emissions reductions associated with the carbon tax and the coal phase-out. And I prepared this, which is where we're really headed in Canada under Trudeau. That's where we need to be going. And this is my totally hack Al Gore moment. This, that's where we're going. That's where we'll be in 2030 in terms of the carbon that we're going to dig up under this government's plan with the deductions deducted. This is the net effect. We need to be there. And that's how fast we're going in that direction. So just keep this stuff in mind as we have the so-called climate debate in Canada. I'm not talking about all the other things in the LEAP Manifesto yet. We haven't even talked about the intersecting crises. I'm going to move on to that now. Hi, Pat. Holy shit, how are you? We're just talking about climate for the moment. We're just talking about emissions. So this is where we're at. Should I leave us here? No, that's bad. That's bad. That's terrible. Al Gore has cherry pickers. And hordes of assistants. Thanks. All right, so this is a surreal landscape in which we find ourselves. And it's very similar to the landscape in which we launched the LEAP Manifesto 15 months ago. It was the run-up to the last federal election. And a number of us found ourselves in this sort of surreal nightmare where we felt keenly the urgency of the climate crisis, of the crisis of the trampling of Indigenous rights, of inequality, and we didn't see any political party or any discussion in the election process that really addressed the extent of the crises that we faced. And, you know, I think we've been through a hallucinatory 1 year of kind of self-deluded hope. For some of us less than others. But still, we allowed ourselves to heave a 1 year sigh of relief at the departure of Harper. And now this is where we are. So the LEAP Manifesto, I think, is more relevant than ever. There was a copy, I think there were leaflets on most of the seats. Let me just quickly ask how many of you have read it, so I can calibrate my exposition. Just about everyone here, that's awesome. How many of you have signed it? All right, we got some signatures to harvest, people. leapmanifesto.org, come on. It's not like there's a time limit. These are epic struggles. Get your signatures on there. Get 10 of your friends. The LEAP Manifesto starts from the premise that we face deep intersecting crises in this country. Not just climate change, but racism. Not just racism, but inequality. Not just inequality, but the systematic infringement on Indigenous land rights. And economic precarity. If the interest rate jumped by 1%, which is not unprecedented, it would be dramatic, but not unprecedented, 1 million Canadians would be unable to pay their household debts. There's 1 million people in this country who are 1 interest rate percentage point away from being underwater. We haven't seen that kind of economic insecurity in decades. But the LEAP is not a belabored critique of our broken status quo. It is instead a set of ambitious and holistic demands. 15 demands to get Canada off fossil fuels in a way that doesn't just tackle climate change, but also addresses those intersecting systemic crises of inequality and racism and the continuing colonial mistreatment of Indigenous people and communities. So in the same breath, the LEAP calls for a torrent of good union jobs in renewable energy and other low-carbon sectors, massive investments in public housing, public transit, public services, and not just any old job creation or any old economic growth, but job creation specifically prioritized for communities who have been most marginalized by our current system of injustice and exclusion. So as I said, it's been 15 months since we launched the manifesto, and it has been, I think, to understate it massively, a wild ride for those of us who have been on the inside. You remember the response to the document, both when it was launched in September of last year and around the time of the NDP convention last spring, was pretty intense. I'm smiling because I met Matt Green at the Progress Summit in Ottawa just like 4 or 5 days before the NDP convention. And I don't know if we were paneling together, I was moderating a panel he was on, and he was like, hey, who are you? And I was like, oh, I'm working on this LEAP Manifesto. Oh, what's that? 5 minutes later, he's interviewing me on his phone, excitedly talking about the LEAP Manifesto. I think Matt's Facebook audience got a 3-day preview for what the rest of the country was about to be subject to. So really there were 2 responses to the LEAP Manifesto when it launched. First, we heard from our elites, and their response was everything you would expect. The Globe and Mail editorial board called it madness. Conrad Black called it national suicide. Thank you. Rex Murphy, the star attraction at the fossil exhibit, currently known as CBC's The National, has milked no fewer than 5 newspaper columns from it. In one of his columns, he called the LEAP Manifesto a wild-eyed, ultra-greenist, anti-capitalist dog machine. Rex, you say that like it's a bad thing. And our most enlightened political leaders have been no less effusive. Christy Clark said that, quote, hundreds of towns would be wiped off the map tomorrow and turned into ghost towns if we decided to follow this plan. Brad Wall calls us grim leapers, which I like, actually. I prefer leapista, but at least he's showing a little creativity. The last throne speech in Saskatchewan said that the LEAP Manifesto would shut down major parts of Saskatchewan's economy, all in the name of some misguided dogma that has no basis in reality. Even Brian Mulrooney crept out beyond the gates of his chateau recently to bravely tell a private audience at the Business Council of Canada, is there any other kind? That the LEAP Manifesto, I will spare you my Brian Mulroney impression, but he said that the LEAP Manifesto is a new philosophy of economic nihilism that must be resisted and defeated. So all of that made us enormously proud. And then at the height of this all-out elite aerial bombardment last spring, there was this extraordinary national poll done by ECOS, one of the major polling firms, and it found that more than half of all Canadians had heard of the LEAP Manifesto, and that a clear majority of NDP, Green Party, and Liberal Party supporters were in agreement with its key demands. Even 20% of Tories were on board. So to Rex, Conrad, Brad, and the gang, we say thank you. The more you smear and misrepresent our cherished manifesto, the more our inboxes runneth over with messages of support, people who want to volunteer, LEAP groups self-organizing across the country, town halls, local campaigns, and meetings like this one. This is a decent crowd, isn't it, for Hamilton? The more these guys expectorate on us from the lofty heights they inhabit. This is the cleaned up version of this. The more people, actual people, say, if these guys hate it so much, it's probably worth a read. Let's remember what we're talking about here. The subtitle of the document is A Call for a Canada Based on Caring for the Earth and One Another. They're right, folks. It's madness. We can't be having that. So we've had this amazing kind of bifurcated blast of response in the past year. Poisonous words raining down from on high, and a blossoming of beautiful organizing rising up from the grassroots. And whichever side of the divide you are on, I think this room has sort of made itself clear, the document has arrived like a little bit of a thunderclap in our national debate. I've been immersed in every one of the skirmishes. As you will recall, but it always bears repeating, the LEAP came out of a meeting that was convened in May of last year that had 60 activists from across the country and a huge constellation of social movements, really a once-in-a-generation alignment of First Nations, food justice, faith and anti-poverty activists, immigrant refugee rights activists, climate folks. We had Indigenous leaders from the tar sands, we had oil workers, even a couple of members of Alberta's NDP government were at that formative meeting. And from that meeting came this document, which is a consensus document, which you can't tell from writing it because it had a kick-ass editor who lives at my house. But it was written by committee. It was literally a consensus document written by committee. So I was one of many people, but I've been I had a front row seat at many of these skirmishes over the last 15 months. So tonight, I could tell you, for instance, the real, true, behind-the-scenes story of the LEAP Manifesto at the NDP convention. Yeah. You'd like that? Or how Rachel Notley's chief of staff tried to sell me on pipelines as a democratic socialist imperative. That's one for the ages. But those inside stories are perhaps better suited to the bar afterwards. Instead, what I'd like to do with the remaining minutes that I have here tonight is to zoom out and share some big picture thoughts on why I think the LEAP has struck such a nerve. I've given this a lot of thought, and I think it's worth sharing here tonight with you in this room, because understanding why the LEAP has made so much noise may give us some clues on how and where we can continue this work together. And after yesterday, we have a hell of a lot of work to do, and we have to double down fast and hard on the work that we're already doing, And we have to figure out, as we get into the larger North American conversation and the shifting political landscape on the continent, how we are adjusting our movement responses in the new political reality. But I want to take the next few minutes to kind of look at why I think the LEAP has had such resonance. Number one, we start from where we are. A massive disconnect when it comes to the national discourse around the climate crisis. The disasters are barreling down on us with increasing speed and intensity. Scientists are now connecting specific weather events to climate change. Everything they warned us about is happening faster than they predicted. The same scientists who have been sounding the alarm for decades are now scrambling to revise their timelines. And in the face of this escalating crisis, with each new storm or drought or flood or fire teaching us the exponential math of intersecting disasters, our political class is offering us solutions that are doubling down on this disastrous status quo. Think of that red line shooting skyward as a result of yesterday's announcements, and how much further we now have to go to get to the shitty, insufficient Harper targets for climate action in Canada. So the Paris Agreement is indeed a historic deal, and at the same time, the country commitments within it would add up to probably more than 3 degrees of warming, if those commitments are even met. And here in Canada, we have the Prime Minister who puts climate at the top of the agenda. He says, no relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. And then he approves projects that entail massive increases in fossil fuel production. He banks climate action on utterly insufficient carbon taxes and an important but minor, in terms of its impact, coal phase-out. So we have daily mounting evidence of the crisis, and governments, they say they get it, unlike in the States, and solutions on offer that are embarrassingly meager, or even further disasters masquerading as solutions, even worse. And into this disconnect, this urgency gap, into this moment comes the LEAP Manifesto, and an opportunity to talk about vastly more profound policy changes than those on offer from our political class, or those considered acceptable by our media class. So the first reason I think the LEAP has resonated is that the scale of the proposal matches the scale of the crisis. And for so many of us, this comes as a cosmic relief. At last, a set of demands that actually acknowledges how much and how fast we need to change. And so for this reason, the LEAP utterly rejects incrementalism, the supposedly pragmatic but disastrously failing approach currently on offer. In exchange, instead, the LEAP calls for change that is transformative. And this is the second reason I think that the manifesto is encouraging social movements, even as it provokes the powerful. Had we, as a global society, started cutting emissions in the early 1990s, when the science was clear and action was called for, perhaps we could have attacked this problem with little steps and gradual measures. But we didn't. And now, as Naomi Klein likes to say, there are no non-radical options left on the table. Either we embrace radical change now to reduce emissions, or the changes that we have wrought on our physical world will force even more radical change upon us. And as we're already seeing, that's change of an uglier, more violent kind. And so the manifesto calls for transformation, not tweaks, for change that is systemic, not symbolic. Third, the LEAP rejects market mechanisms in favor of bold government and community action. This is an important advance, because our elites and technocrats are still enamored of harnessing that magic of the market to solve what they call wicked problems like climate change, cap and trade, emissions trading schemes, a nominal price on carbon, and the like. But we've had some of those measures in place in various parts of the world for years now. There's a track record, and it is one of abject failure. Corporations find a way to game the systems, emissions don't go down at all or far too slowly, and most importantly, the majority of people don't benefit from these carbon reduction plans. But it's not just market mechanisms that the LEAP rejects, it's the logic of the market itself. So fourth, I think the LEAP rings true because it sees the climate crisis not as a technical problem to be solved by engineers, but as a crisis of a system and an economic philosophy. The LEAP identifies the root cause of the climate crisis, and it's the dominant economic logic of our time. Extractivism to feed perpetual growth rooted in ever-increasing consumption. Extractivism is, of course, the worldview that sees everything as a commodity from which to extract value. First and foremost, all natural resources, but also people. Whether the labor of the working classes or the traditional knowledge of indigenous people, everything is commodified for maximum extraction of profit. These core underpinnings of our modern capitalist system are driving many of society's ills. Inequality, resource depletion, species extinction, never-ending crimes against indigenous people, migrants, refugees, and other marginalized communities. But it's the climate crisis that is the most universal, the most existential consequence of a system based on the absurd premise that we can have infinite, indiscriminate growth on a finite planet. That logic is on a collision course with our very survival. And that's why the LEAP puts another worldview front and center in its first words and its first demands, calling for an economy based not on extraction, but an economy based on caring. In place of endless competition and domination of nature, it tells a different story about our place in the world. It's a philosophy of interconnection, a reminder that what happens to you is happening to me. It's a call for a society based on an entirely different set of values. The LEAP doesn't argue for a moment that we have to wait for some future post-capitalist utopia in order to solve the climate crisis. Anything but. It's filled with demands that must be met today, that must be met yesterday. But it's clear from the framing of the document that the driving force of our capitalist system, extract and extract, to consume and consume, must be fundamentally addressed if we're to get off the road to climate oblivion. That is a scary level of change. But it's honest. And people know in their bones that it's the kind of change that's required. And that's the fifth reason I think the LEAP has sparked such intense reaction. In order to fulfill those 15 demands, we need to challenge every pillar holding up the edifice of our current economic system, which in a room like this I will feel free and emboldened to call neoliberalism. Can I say that word here? Thank you. I don't have to spend half an hour saying what I mean by neo. We can do that in the discussion period. Let me just briefly count the ways that I think the LEAP Manifesto challenges the basic assumptions of our modern economy. We can't address the climate crisis without restoring the capacity of governments to govern. In other words, fiscal capacity. Governments need to be able to spend massively in a way that will truly change the direction of our economy and society. Today, in Canada, the day Trudeau took office, federal spending as a proportion of GDP, as a proportion of our economy, is at a 60-year low. The last time the federal government had this little capacity to spend, we didn't have healthcare, we didn't have pensions, we didn't have many of the elements of the welfare state. Meanwhile, corporate taxes have been cut in half in a generation, and companies are not reinvesting that windfall in the real economy where people get hired and do productive work that blah, 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 is supposed to lead to economic activity. In fact, money sitting on the sidelines, sitting on the balance sheets of corporations, hoarded rather than invested by the most powerful and richest corporations in our country, is now something in the range of $640 billion. Corporations are hoarding an amount larger than the national debt. So how can we unleash wartime levels of public spending, put in place an industrial strategy to reconfigure our economy, create hundreds of thousands of good union jobs while reducing emissions, if all that money is being hoarded by corporations rather than put to productive use in the public interest? We have to restore the capacity of governments to raise and spend money, to change direction. And speaking of government spending, if we're going to make this great transition in a way that benefits the majority, we have to smash the logic of austerity for good. We can't be shutting down libraries and starving healthcare and education and watching our infrastructure crumble or privatizing it under the guise of P3s and other mechanisms, when we need to be rebuilding the physical and social resilience of our communities in the face of all the storms to come. And while we're burying orthodoxies, we have to tear up and completely rethink most existing and proposed trade deals. I'm not standing here saying NAFTA is the worst deal ever negotiated. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the logic of corporate trade deals. When TransCanada can sue the United States for $15 billion for Obama's one major climate decision to reject the Keystone XL pipeline, when Ontario has a green job creation plan that can be stopped in its tracks by a complaint at the WTO, when environmental regulations and local benefits can be declared illegal in closed-door trade courts, the whole international trading regime has become a threat to our survival, and it needs to be undone. Sorry. And it's the same with the logic of privatization. Key pieces of the economy must be in public hands so that they can be run in the public interest. We shouldn't be privatizing Hydro One, we should be democratizing it. In other words, you can't turn the supertanker of our energy system when you've already sold the engine room to Enbridge. And finally, we have to confront the insanity of a global economy based on hyperconsumption. The world economic system in the 21st century is designed for maximum extraction, the cheapest production, staggering levels of transportation, the emissions of which are not even counted, and overconsumption in the rich parts of poorer countries and in the rich parts of richer countries. This consumer treadmill is making us sick. It benefits the richest at the expense of the poorest, it puts us profoundly out of balance with the natural world, and it's locking in rising emissions of suicidal proportions. And all that consumption in societies like ours, it doesn't even make us happy. Like, here we are. The global economy is basically arranged for our maximum benefit as privileged people here in Canada. And we're frazzled and lonely and disconnected and seeking retail therapy to assuage the panic of opening our credit card bills. So if we're really going to deal with a crisis as systemic and profound as climate change, we know we need to change the very purpose and shape of our modern economy and refocus on what the manifesto calls caring for the earth and caring for one another. This does not mean a return to horse and buggy. It means recognizing the centrality, the economic centrality of the caring economy. Healthcare, education, care for seniors and children, defense of land and water, public services and the arts. This is all low-carbon work. These are green jobs. It's already the greatest part of the real economy and the part that gives us the most satisfaction and benefit and interconnection. It needs to be massively expanded, not relentlessly cut. And so on every front, fulfilling the demands of the LEAP Manifesto would require economic transformation because our current orthodoxy is a barrier to almost everything we need to do to fight climate change, inequality, and racism. These implications of the LEAP are challenging, I don't diminish that, but they resonate because we know in our bones that continuing the status quo is to sleepwalk to catastrophe. And so the hunger for truly radical change is there, and it's deep. And yet, you can't scare people into change that profound. Terror is not a state from which we can build a better world. And so, the final feature of the LEAP that I really appreciate, and that I have felt ripple out through our national conversation, is this. It seeks to inspire people with a positive vision of the world we want, not depress people by dwelling on what is going so wrong. Although, like I started tonight, let's not leave it outside, but let's not spend the whole evening there. The LEAP resonates because it's hopeful, because it's forward-looking. It articulates what's needed to create a better life for all, a life of less debt, of more time for family and friends, more time in the natural world, less drilling and dumping, more caring and repairing. And that, it turns out, is a place where many of us want to dwell. You know, when you fight for real change, the first thing you're told is that it's impractical. It's unrealistic. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Politics is the art of the possible. Or, as was said last week, after a perfectly ineffectual and totally bland youth climate summit a week ago, the Environment Ministry tweeted, "Need to have youth voice at every table, have to be able to contribute, but youth need to learn how to play the game." This is the message, right? Today, in the wake of the pipeline decision yesterday, social media is spilling over with mansplainers, lecturing environmentalists that Canada's climate policy isn't perfect, but this is what's politically possible. Instead of complaining that it's never enough, they say, you gotta work within the system. Make proposals that are feasible. So the problem is, if our response to the climate crisis remains within what's currently considered politically feasible, we face doom, ruin, extinction, catastrophe. How many synonyms do we need? So here's the response of the LEAP to that tyranny of pragmatism. When we're told to modify our demands, to be more practical, our job isn't to shrink our dreams down until they fit inside that shrunken box of the possible. Our job is to build pressure inside that box until it expands, until it explodes, and we can enact solutions that are actually on the scale of the crisis we're trying to meet. When we're dealing with the greatest crisis of our time, our job is not to work within what's possible. Our job is to change what's possible. And that's why I'm here tonight. I think that's why you're here tonight.